Welcome to the Careers by Jenn podcast, episode 290. On today's podcast, Jenn talks with Alissa Carpenter about why it's important to have, rather than prevent, difficult conversations. I sure hope this isn't going to be one of those, 'cause that would be super awkward.
Hey, I'm Jenn Swanson, and Careers by Jenn is where I help you to get the job, love your work, and advance your career, and I talk about wellness and success topics too. This podcast is actually ending production after episode 300. However, you can find me over at Careers by Jenn on YouTube, where I will be continuing to share career tips, advice, wellness, and success topics, and much, much more. It's been a 10-year run here on Careers by Jenn on the podcast, and until we are at episode 300, I invite you to continue listening. Go back and listen to the archives, and please enjoy this show. Thank you so much for being here. Hard conversations are just that, hard. And many of us would do all sorts of shenanigans to avoid having them. Well, because they're hard, and we are afraid. Welcome to the show today. I'm Jenn, and I'm so glad that you are here. And thanks to all of you who came to my live class about stress earlier this week. It was really fun to have you there, and I hope to be doing some more of those live events in the future. This podcast is recorded on the unceded and traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Katzie, the Kwantlen, the Stolo, and the Coquitlam First Nations. And I am really grateful that you are here today in the home stretch of this podcast. I'm so glad to have you with me. My guest today is Alissa Carpenter. Alissa is the author of How to Listen and How to Be Heard: Inclusive Conversations at Work. She is a workplace expert and owner of Everything's Not Okay and That's Okay, where she provides training, consulting, and speaking services to organizations all over the world. Alissa earned her M.Ed in Social and Comparative Analysis in Education from the University of Pittsburgh. She's a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach and is accredited in the Strong Interest Inventory and Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Alissa's work helps to bridge communication gaps in the workplace across generations, genders, races, religions, job functions, and geographies. And she has worked with organizations ranging from nonprofits to multi-billion-dollar enterprises. Alissa has delivered a TEDx talk on authentic workplace communication, and she's been featured in media outlets including Forbes, ABC, Fox, and CBS. And you can visit Alissa online at notokaythat'sokaycoach.com, and I'll link to that in the show notes. And you can even find out more about her book in a little YouTube video that I made this week called 5 Must-Read Books for Success. So check that out, because I talk about Alissa's book in that video as well over on the Careers by Jenn YouTube channel. This interview was recorded in the fall of 2020, and I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. So, Alissa, how would you define a difficult conversation?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think anything that can be heated or mixed emotions involved. There's so many types of difficult conversations. I think you can talk about personal, you can talk about professional, but I think anything that has any type or could have emotion involved in some capacity can be difficult. It might not be difficult for the receiver or the sender of the message, but it's probably for the reciprocal party. Can lead to a difficult, controversial, or can be a misconstrued conversation.
And that's an interesting point, because it's all about perception, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Sometimes you'll say something that you think is fine and have no idea that it landed the wrong way. and then somebody else will be fussing and festering about what you said to them, and you have no idea until they say something or they stop talking to you.
It's true. And I talk about it all the time, the difference between intent and impact. So the intent of your message might be one thing, but how it lands and the impact might be another. So that wasn't a difficult conversation for you to have because your intent of the message was A, but how it was received was Z. And now that person felt like they were in a difficult conversation and needs to initiate another one, right? A follow-up conversation potentially on what you said or did that might have offended them.
Right. So, yeah, it's an interesting thing because I do some workshops, and I'm doing a couple this month. Well, when we're recording this, and I'm doing a couple, and I did a whole bunch on the same topic, workshops on fostering a respectful workplace, and it's about discrimination and about workplace professionalism and all of that. And as far as the human rights code here in Canada anyway, and I'm sure it's the same around the world, it's less about intent and more about perception. So if somebody feels that they've been insulted or discriminated against, then that is something serious to be listened to. And I know that in the past, year and a half, a lot of this has come to the forefront with the Me Too movement and with all the stuff that's going on around discrimination and racism and everything that's happening in the world. And it's fascinating because some people get very defensive about that. And I wonder what you've noticed in the work that you're doing around that kind of thing.
It's true. It's such a difficult place, I think, to be in on both sides of the coin or equation or conversation, because if your intent was one thing and it impacted somebody another way, you automatically feel defensive of, well, I didn't mean, why did you think that? I didn't mean that. I was thinking this, and how did you possibly do that, right? Or so you're getting defensive about it because you didn't mean that. That wasn't your intent. Sometimes we blame, well, if you didn't feel this way, or if you didn't do X, Y, and Z, this wouldn't happen, right? We have our defense mechanisms that are coming across. And it's so difficult sometimes to get to that space where you can appreciate where the other person is coming from. And to me, that's even the first step to having these conversations. Well, one is taking a deep breath and taking a step back before you say anything, right, that you might say or do that might offend people, but coming from the best intentions and understanding that it was probably really difficult for that person to even come to you in the first place and say how that impacted them. And sometimes then there's even, and I'm sure you use this as well in your trainings, but just the switch of a few words. So sometimes we say, I'm sorry if that offended you, but it's not a question. That person did come to you, they are offended. So changing that language to that, I am sorry that I offended you. It affirms where they are, you're apologizing for your actions. So small tweaks and things that we say and do that can really create that conversation where it is a conversation and not more of an accusatory tone or defensive. You're kind of even the playing field a little bit. So then you can start to listen to understand what's next. How do I respond, if anything?
And language is so important. I mean, I love thinking about language and how even changing one word can make such a difference. And that's a really good example that, yeah, exactly. The if and the that is such a good switch. I mean, there's an exercise that I sometimes do in a different workshop, a communication workshop, where it's the yes and. It's like the improv thing. You're having I give a group of people a controversial subject. I ask them to choose a controversial subject, whatever it happens to be, and then they have to begin every single sentence with yes, but, and we do the whole round with yes, but, and each person has to go around on the same topic and say yes, but. And it's interesting to ask them how they feel at the end of that. And it's quite controversial. People get hyped up, people get mad. And then we do the thing again and we switch the but to and. And so everybody has to go around and have this conversation on a different controversial topic, but the sentence they have to begin with is yes, and then we talk about the impact of that one word and how different it is and how it feels. And it's remarkable that people feel more collaborative and less confrontational and less defensive. And it's one little word.
But it's so funny. Not that I was trying to remove the word but from my vocabulary, but when you're sending an email or having conversations, I like this idea, but we could do it this way. Well, do you really like the idea? Because you said I like it, and then you don't like it, and then it leads this weird confusion. But if I really like the idea that you presented, and I think we should also add X, Y, and Z, not but, because I think the but really negates anything that you've said before it, depending on what you've said. So that tweak is a huge difference, and it can look different. So even in my book, I talk about yes and what you can do, but that's great and that works. And it's the addition of the and building on somebody's idea versus taking away or negating what they were saying that I think just changes the whole tone of a conversation.
Absolutely, because otherwise you're dismissing everything they've just said, and that's rude. and sometimes it seems like we're not actually listening then, or being open to their point of view or their perspective when we're saying but. So yeah, it's hard to remember because I do it accidentally and I don't intend to, and it's something to work on for sure. But it's similar to that if and that, and I really like those two words, that
and
switch.
The phrase just or I'm sorry, like some of these we say a lot, and there's the phrase just is something I've been working on a lot because I think it dwindles down your message a little bit. A lot of it has to do with self-esteem and confidence, but if you're going to bring somebody or start a difficult conversation, I was just offended by what you were saying, I just wanted to check in about what's going on. It's okay to check in. I am checking in on what's happening. I feel offended, not I just feel offended. That word, it's unnecessary to put in there, and I do it all the time. And I did just a search of my email, and it's hundreds of times. And I encourage listeners just to think about it as an activity. And there is a plugin, and I'm blanking on the name, for Google, for your Gmail, that I think it's just say sorry or something along those lines, where it will pull things from your email and show and share with you. Do you want to send this? Maybe but isn't the right word, or just probably doesn't make sense. What is decreasing the way you want to say it, so then you can adjust it before the email sends. So I thought that was just an interesting trick to make it sound a little bit more confident.
That's brilliant. I know when I was doing my coaching training, the training that we had, our final evaluation was a video session where you were videotaped, recorded coaching, and you had to role play with the other people in the class, and you had to coach somebody through a situation that was set up, and there was an instructor and there was a camera on. And then once the camera stopped, the whole thing was evaluated by everybody in the room. It's very intense. Yeah. And we were given the recording to then study and come back and etc. Anyway, I remember one of the instructors said to me, "Why do you keep using passive language?" And I thought, whoa. And I hadn't noticed it before, but I would do that. I would say, I'm wondering if, perhaps, I'm sorry, but, and all these things. And it was just part of the language system that I had, which was diminishing. And it was kind of, I'm puttering around the bush. I'm not getting right to the core of what I wanted to say. I'm tiptoeing around and dancing around by using all this passive language. And I thought, wow, that was probably the best lesson I got out of that exercise.
Well, and I remember having a professor, it must have been maybe it was undergraduate, where anytime you would have a presentation and you would say or ah, they would give you tick marks. And at the end of the day, you would leave with all these tick marks that you had. And it's those things that stick with you a little bit. And I was going to say something, and then I'm just blanking on what I was going to say about what you mentioned, because I just think it's interesting to notice. And when my 10-year-old started saying, I'm sorry, or just, is when I started realizing that I was saying it, and that's how she was picking up that language. So just even being aware of how it's being modeled to other people. So if you're a leader or supervisor and you're noticing these, I don't want to say bad habits, but this passive language is being used amongst your team, it might make you a little bit more aware of what's happening or what's going on.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. So our title today is Why It's Important to Have Rather Than Prevent Difficult Conversations. Why is that so?
I think I see so many times with my clients that these conversations don't happen, and just in your family or friend situation, and they just bubble up, right? You're annoyed. Now, all of a sudden you have this explosive, and whatever that might look like, conversation about everything that went on for the past 6 months, year. You're talking about your annual reviews. And it's so important to just have these mini conversations along the way. I think with difficult conversations or anything in general, and it's not to put the onus on the person who necessarily felt offended all the time, but the offender or the other person on the other side won't know they said or did anything to you, or they'll continue to do it because they don't see anything wrong with it. Nobody said anything, nobody did anything. So they'll just keep continuing that, and that will just fester with you as an individual of, oh my gosh, can you believe this person did it, right? And then gossip starts, and then you just feel frustrated and you become disengaged. So starting those conversations is so important for, I think, your mental health as an individual, for your team to be more productive, and for organization in general to be more engaged. But they're not easy, right? You're putting yourself out there, you're building up the courage to talk about something sometimes.
And so what would be one of the first steps to initiating a difficult conversation that you have to have in the workplace?
It's interesting because what you were mentioning before, I think about almost 3 phases of things people do. And the first is to avoid, which we were talking about essentially not doing, is avoid not having the conversation. The second is tiptoeing. So tiptoeing around by using that passive language, or not exactly saying what you want to say because you don't want to offend the other person. And the third, which I see happening a lot now, is overcompensating and being too nice and apologizing for things maybe of your race, your ethnicity, and gender have done for hundreds of years. So overcompensating. To me, it's taking that step back, if you're initiating that conversation, and identifying, where is this person in the spectrum? Do you need to have this conversation? And I don't think every conversation needs to be had, despite what I had before. If you don't have to interact with this person all the time, if this is somebody you see very infrequently, this is a one-off thing, you know they just had a bad day, you might not have to initiate that conversation. If you decide that you do, taking that step back and figuring out what exactly about that offended you. What do you want to address? What is your goal of having the conversation? Because sometimes we start conversations without a goal or something in mind. And it could just be that you want to share. You don't want any feedback. You just want to let them know that they've offended you. They've said or done something. Let's squash it. Let's be over it. Or this is something that's happening frequently. We need to work on this and have a conversation. So it's taking the step back, figuring out how you feel, and then identifying what you want out of that conversation.
And then it takes a lot of guts and a lot of courage, depending on your personality, to do that. I think it is also very important what language you use when you initiate that conversation. Do you have any ideas about that?
The first thing, I've seen a lot of mistakes of, let's have this conversation as a group, as a team, in a meeting, in public. That's not really the space to have what can be a very uncomfortable or difficult topic. You don't want it to seem like you're putting the other person on the spot. So going up to them, emailing them, whatever virtual or workspace that you're in right now, to let them know that you want to talk about this. I'm not one for conflict. I will avoid it at any cost possible. And if I can practice or even write out what I want to say, what I want to get out of it, is really helpful to me in talking to a mentor or somebody I trust about, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling. Is this make sense, what I want to say? And essentially practicing it out loud before you bring it to the other person. And I think, and obviously we don't know where we're going to be in 2021 in terms of in-person, virtual, combination of both. But I think any way that you can create an even playing field for both people is important. So if you are a supervisor and addressing a colleague or vice versa, you don't want somebody in their power seat and then somebody across from you in their chair. So if you can do a walking meeting, a standing meeting, like that level makes a really big difference. So then it becomes a conversation and not feeling like an attack or you're in trouble, your mom's calling you the principal's office or whatever that is. So that psychological even playing field also means it makes a difference besides what you're going to say as well.
Yeah, body language is huge. I know when I had some exceedingly difficult conversations that I had to initiate in some of the roles that I've had in the past, I made sure we were sitting side by side instead of across from one another, because I do think body language is absolutely key, because we communicate so much through our bodies and you can say a whole lot without saying anything. And we forget sometimes, even on screen, and especially on screen now, because we're not physically in the same space. It's more important, which is why it's a little bit more tiring to be watching people on screen all the time to see how they react.
If you don't have opportunity to be in person, try that screen, right? Try the Zoom, the FaceTime, the Skype to actually see the other person. Sometimes we default to phone, text, email is impossible, I think, to grab the tone out of it. It can just make a situation worse. So any way that you can see somebody else's emotions and get that nonverbal space, I think is important. So anything with high emotions in any capacity should always be done, in my opinion, first in person. And if not, try to really simulate that in any way possible.
And one of the things also that can help with communication, I think in general, is paying attention to people's nonverbals when you're speaking, because sometimes you'll say something and you get, well, I can tell, I don't know, I guess it takes practice, that it hasn't landed well. And the other person may not say a thing, and they may never say anything. But I've noticed that there's a facial expression, or I've noticed an eye roll, or I've noticed, it can even be way more subtle than that, but I've noticed they've checked out. They're not listening. There's something, and it may be nothing to do with me. It may be something they're worrying about, something they're thinking about in their own lives, whatever. But I find it's good to check in and just say, I noticed that this happened during the meeting. Is there anything you want to talk about? Just to check in.
Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with the tone too, right? Of you're not accusing somebody. It's not, you were totally checked out at this meeting. What were you thinking? What were you doing? It's, I noticed you weren't really paying attention. Is everything okay? Is there anything going on, right? You're coming from it from a place of kindness and caring and want to be there as a support, which I think is just, it's really helpful. And, part of the conversation too is when we talk about communication, we talk a lot about talking, but most of it is listening, right? So if somebody is coming to you and saying that you've offended them in some type of way, it's not the time to cut them off. It's not the time to talk about yourself or provide feedback or suggestions. Listen and really listen and take that breath after they're done. Really fun, I'm sure you do it too, an improv exercise is people say like hot dog, and then you would say dog man, and then you keep just going back and forth, like thinking about ways where you can enhance your active listening skills as a team, as a group, because you usually have your answer or your response before the person even finished, which kind of negates the conversation in the first place.
Yeah, those are always so fun. I love doing workshops and doing especially listening exercises, because there are so many of them that are so effective. That's good. So we have being in the right setting, not doing it in front of others. We have making sure that we're using language that's supportive. We're talking about listening well. What happens if you're just not getting through, or you're not feeling like the other person has heard you in what you wanted to say to them, the difficult thing you wanted to say?
I think there's a couple factors. To me, in a professional situation, it depends what you're trying to get across. If this somebody, and I'm talking about sexual harassment, like those types of things, if these things keep happening, you need to take it up a level. And it's extremely difficult to change someone's behavior, if not impossible. You're talking about years and years of learned experiences. You're trying to, in one conversation, which isn't going to happen, have them unlearn these things. So if it's to that level, obviously talk to human resources. You can even ask that person, do you have any questions for me? Or what do you mean by this? Have it become this really reciprocal conversation. And some people, if you don't know them very well, or even if you do, not the eye roll, but there could be some not talking and they're more just deliberative and thinking and taking it in. It doesn't mean that they're not paying attention. They're not comprehending. They just need a moment to process. So silence during those conversations is okay. You don't have to keep pressing and pushing. The more you know about the person and how they think and process, that situation will be a little bit easier. But I think it's okay to go back if there's too much silence or too long of a time to ask, do you have any questions for me in that situation? Or what do you mean? Or how can I process this with you?
And what are the benefits do you find from actually taking the risk and getting your courage up and having these conversations? What good comes of it?
So that's tricky because I think depending on the level of difficult things, there's three reasons why people don't engage in these conversations. One is from a hierarchy perspective at work, right? If I have these conversations, will I risk my promotion? Am I stepping on somebody's toes? Will I fall in that hierarchy in terms of the organizational structure? Then it's social hierarchy. Will I be ostracized by a group of people? My friends, will they no longer be my work friends? And the third is sometimes it is really hard to find the value in having these conversations. A lot to me is truthfully mental health and engagement of your team. If there is something that is just, something happens all the time, and even microaggressions, if things happen all the time, if we don't address it, nothing will change, right? The way we communicate with each other won't change. How we treat one another won't change. So it's almost by not having these conversations, things won't happen. If we do, it's still risky, right? It's still risky to move forward. But I think if you feel offended, or if you're on the other side of those conversations, if you're not engaging in those, you will probably be looking for another job in the near future, because you'll feel so out of that loop, out of the inclusion space within your organization.
It's also, I think when you do address these things, and not if you're doing it every 10 minutes, but when it counts, when it's important, when it matters, when it's going to make a difference to how you carry on. I think when you do, you can then let it go. And the relationship can be stronger for it. The respect can be more because of it, rather than not saying anything and then festering and stressing about it and then reliving it in your head. What a waste of time and energy.
And even in your personal life, if you have a disagreement with your friends, if you don't bring that up, you're going to be so annoyed at that friend for a really long time, and they're never going to know about it, and they're going to keep doing it. And then, it just keeps, we have so much else to worry about and things that are happening. So it feels truthfully like a weight is off your shoulders if you just explain it. And you don't want the kind of boy who cried wolf situation of this little thing bothers me, now this little thing, now this little thing. Pick and choose truly what's important to you and what matters before you start engaging in 100 difficult conversations with people where they're like, they don't even know where to start because everything that they do and say is wrong. So pick and choose what's really most meaningful and important to you.
I remember a situation where in my other work that I do, I'm a clergy person, and I was doing a memorial service for somebody who was the spouse of somebody I knew, but I had never met the husband. And it was at a funeral home, so it wasn't in a church setting. And most of the people that were there were business partners and friends of this person who was the deceased. And afterwards, I had a gentleman come up to me in, all dressed up in a suit and everything. And he said, a woman minister. He said, that's both amusing and entertaining. And I was so shocked. I did not know what to say. And he walked away, and that has bothered me for years now, because I first of all, I didn't want to make a scene because the widow was nearby and I cared for her and she was the reason I was there. And I didn't want to make a big stink, but I should have said something. And that has bothered me ever since. And I've told that story over and over again because incredibly rude and incredibly insulting and misogynistic, and the list goes on and on and on. And I've thought about all the wonderful things I could have said. And had I just addressed it in the moment, it would be gone. I wouldn't worry about that anymore. But it bugs me so much. I've hung on to it all this time.
But I talk about a situation in my TED Talk about a supervisor of mine. We were in a conversation and called out in the middle of the room that my face looked like the map of Jerusalem, which I didn't say anything because exactly, who says that?
What does that even mean?
There's so many, but then it was also, I don't want to start to get down, which I did, a rabbit hole of trying to figure out what that other person, just like when your situation, we have no idea what the other person is thinking by what they say. Maybe he really meant to say that he enjoyed it. It was amusing. But once we also get down the rabbit hole of trying to get in the mindset of the individual, it just doesn't work. But I never said anything. I was younger in my career. I didn't want to offend anybody. And I wish I did because I had to continue to have a relationship with this individual. And it's 10 times as much, like they had to do 10 times more to build up my trust than anybody would have once trust is broken. It just takes that much more. But it's those one-off situations where you can always think of something like the next day, an hour later, but in that moment, you're like just taken aback. You don't even know how you feel about it because you're still trying to process it. But if you went back in that second, you might have said something that wasn't appropriate or okay, but let me go to the bathroom and then come back of, that's really interesting. Why do you feel that way? Can you tell me a little bit more? And without putting words in their mouth, allowing them the space and time to share with you their perspective. And then maybe the impact will be a little bit different, or maybe that's a discussion, further down the line.
Yeah, it's exactly. And I don't know I don't know this person, never met him before. He heard me speak, for part of an hour at a memorial service in between other speakers and all the rest of it. And so I don't know where he was coming from, but I just, it felt so offensive and awful to me.
Yes.
It's like, I've got a master's degree. I'm perfectly legitimate, like it just brought up all this stuff. And it's interesting. Had I been able to ask him exactly that, that's a fascinating comment. Would you say more? But I wasn't. I was so stunned, I think, in the moment. And of course, your amygdala takes over, right? The emotions hijack everything.
Yeah. And then you do go down this rabbit hole of, especially, and I notice it more with women than men, and there's so much research of, now you're looking at your credentials. I do have a master's degree. I have been doing this, right? Like you're almost trying to justify why you should have this role, which is not even what we should be doing. And that it's like, no, he was rude. He shouldn't have said that. But then you go down this, oh, am I qualified? I'm not qualified. I do have all these things. I checked all these boxes, and it's just this explosion of emotions.
Yeah, it's funny what we do to ourselves, isn't it? And so having the difficult conversations, I think, sometimes can stop that rumination that you might have later on about the situation. Should I, shouldn't I? And it's like, I often say, you're at a family dinner when we used to be able to have big family dinners in the before times, when you had your whole family together and that one person tells that same story of something that happened 12 years ago that they've never addressed so they bring it up at every family dinner. You hear about this horrible thing that Aunt so-and-so did to so-and-so and it's such a waste of energy and such a waste of breath, I think, to have to relive these things over and over and over again instead of just addressing it if it's that important.
And a difficult conversation too, even thinking kind of at the place and time we're in right now, could even be asking for flexibility or time off or anything like that, where the answer could be no. So it doesn't necessarily mean you've said or done something that has offended somebody or has a different impact. Is getting up that courage to have what could be for you a very difficult conversation that could make a difference, in the future. But I think, in situations like that, even thinking externally of this is important to you, how and why has this been done, and for what's the benefit to the organization, thinking bigger than yourself to try to have as much information and facts and data and stories as possible in your arsenal as you practice it. So it's less of a chance of that no, or a okay, no, but compromise. So if I can't do it long term and work from home like the situation now, what can I do in the short term? So think about your plan ABC for maybe this difficult conversation, so you feel more equipped if a no comes across. How will you react? What will you say? What will you do?
So it's kind of role playing it out in advance so that you have, or writing it out or something, so that you have a bit of a plan. And that's important in having a difficult conversation, is to plan it, right?
Yeah. And know that it might not be the last difficult conversation you have with that person, right? If this is a behavior, again, we were talking about before, it's learned so much over time, they might do it again and not be intentional about it of, hi, I wanted to let you know that you mentioned that thing again and it really upset me. Can we work on that? Or whatever the case may be, it's probably going to be an ongoing thing. And I've known a lot of people who've essentially had accountability partners. Somebody reached out and just said, you talk too much in meetings, and brought that. And that was a difficult conversation. And that's, oh, I didn't realize that. Can you let me know, or give me a hand signal in the middle of a meeting to let me know that I've talked too much, right? You can develop that relationship in that space, so somebody else is also helping you and holding you accountable for the actions in which you want to change.
I remember when I was 19 years old and I was first working in the hospital. I had gone to college and taken the training, and I was working in the hospital system. And I got a full-time job on a medical floor back when they had head nurses, with a head nurse who was the scariest woman ever. She wore her hair in a great big bun with pencils shoved in it, and she wore a lab coat, and the doctors called her Mrs. And she had a temper. She would throw things. And I remember that she could get really, really snarky. And I accidentally said something that was flat out honest when she asked me a question. And she said something. She said something, and it's a word I won't use right now, but she said, oh, so-and-so thought I was the B word. And she says, Jennifer, do you think that? And I was caught off guard. And I said, I didn't say that. Everyone else said it, but I didn't say it. And then I literally threw my hand over my mouth because I thought I've just lost this job. And she burst out laughing. She just burst out laughing. And after that, we had this great relationship. And she used to say to me exactly what you said. She'd get mad and she'd get feisty. And she said, Jennifer, tell me to go have a banana whenever I get that way. And I thought, okay, that's our signal. So I did. I was true to my word. And when she got real feisty with, usually it was a staff member or a doctor or somebody, and she'd start getting really amped up and nasty, and I'd say, Diane, go have a banana. And she'd just smile. And then she'd
hand her one on the side. Here, I got your snack.
she'd smile, or she'd walk away or whatever. But we had this awesome working relationship because we understood each other, and she had given me permission to do that.
That's the key, right? To develop those relationships, to get the permission to do those things. But that took a lot of, I know you didn't intentionally mean to do it, but it took a lot of courage. And the way you did it was sort of funny. You weren't calling her that. You were just joking around. And honestly, people don't even know, toxic people don't usually realize that they have toxic behavior. It's just things that they've been doing. And unless somebody said it, right? You can't imagine, that was probably the first time she just overheard somebody say it, but people have been saying it forever. And then it was, wait, am I? It was this first time of,
Well, and to her credit, like no one else wanted that job. It was a Monday to Friday dream job, full-time job. And in that industry, we usually started off on the call sheet, like on call or very part-time. And I walked right into this job and everyone else said, "Ooh, you're going to be working for the Dragon Lady." Like that was her nickname that she maybe or maybe didn't know about.
Mhm.
And I thought, and I remember saying at 19, I can put up with anything for a year. And it ended up, I was there in that particular position for 4 years. And, she cross-stitched me a beautiful tablecloth and threw me a wedding shower, like we became really good friends. And everyone else was scared of her, but underneath all that gruff exterior toughness was a real sweetheart. So it took the time and effort to get that relationship going, but I think there was a certain amount of self-awareness and honesty on her part too, so it worked.
I do love how you also mentioned people saying, "Oh, you're working for the Dragon Lady." I think that's how you referred to her. And it's so hard not to be part of that gossip or saying that. But when we do that, you automatically are like, "Oh my gosh, like what did I sign up for? I think I can do it. I can do this for this year." So, and I found myself in the positions where I've said, not Dragon Lady, but something where I'm like, why am I feeding into this? But as an individual, making the conscious effort to let people make their own choices and let people perceive people how they want to get to know them before jumping right in, I think is so important.
Yeah.
Then you're automatically off on the weird or wrong foot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Alissa, I love your book. I've got a copy of your book here, and I've How to Listen and How to Be Heard, Inclusive Conversations at Work. And I'm really highly recommending this book to anybody out there who is interested. And maybe you could tell the listeners where to find you.
Sure. I am available on my website at notokaythat'sokaycoach.com and pretty active also on LinkedIn.
So not okay, that's okay.
Coach.com.
And do you have one last piece of advice for the Careers by Jenn listener today?
Yes. We talked a little bit about this before, but gaining that courage to have those difficult conversations, I think is so important. There's no 5 easy steps really to having these difficult conversations. And these conversations aren't linear. Just because we start out one way doesn't mean somebody is going to come back and say this very specific thing and you know how to come back to. But I think the more you practice, the more you have phrases in your back pocket of, "That's interesting, let me look into that, thank you." Whatever those phrases are, and they come off as genuine, the more secure you'll feel when having those conversations.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been so full of information for people, and I really hope that people will reach out and come and see what you're doing and get a copy of your book. I really enjoyed your conversation today.
I did too. Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Careers by Jenn with Jenn Swanson. If you like what you heard, please share this. If every single person listening today shared this episode with just one friend, our audience would be twice as big just like that. And the more people we can help with our content, the better. So help out a friend and help grow our audience by sharing this show with someone you know who would benefit from the content. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, take good care.